Thank you, Chris, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for coming along. As you've heard, I will be talking about an intriguing text by the ancient historian Xenophon, his Anabasis, and how we might approach this text through later maps. But first, a few words about the work itself. Written around 370 BC, the Anabasis recounts Xenophon's experience as a soldier under Cyrus the Younger, who tried unsuccessfully to seize the Persian throne. When Cyrus was killed in battle, Xenophon and thousands of Greek mercenaries were stranded deep inside Persia. And in books 3 to 7, Xenophon describes how he rose to prominence among the remaining Greeks and eventually led them all the way back home to Greece. And now, of course, his account is an invaluable historical source and has often been praised for its vividness. Plutarch already noticed how Xenophon draws us right into the dangers of battle. But even when the action slows, we still move through space together with the characters. So it's a kind of relational geography. We share the Greeks' view, like when Xenophon says that they marched keeping the Euphrates to their right. Still, it isn't always easy to determine exactly where the Greeks went, especially once they reach Armenia and the famous Mount Decies, where they first caught sight of the sea. Xenophon never gives us a bird's eye view, so to speak, but his focus remains on the experiences of the Greeks, which probably has to do with the apologetic tendency of his work. But here, later reception fills in the gap. Although we know of no maps produced for the Anabasis in antiquity, we do have something comparable. The first manuscript I'd like to show, the 15th century Codex, contains the end of Book 7, which modern editors now regard as a later edition. It seems that a reader tried to expand Xenophon's text first by listing all the countries that the Greeks had passed through, and then by tallying up the days and distances. So we end up with the kind of overview that we don't usually get with the Anabasis. Interestingly, the passage even converts Persian parasangs into Greek stadia, just like later mapmakers would do. This summary, of course, was preserved only in Byzantine copies of the text, and it's to these same manuscripts that we must turn for the first actual illustrations. One example is Canon Greek 39, the second of the two Anabasis copies held here at the Bodleian, which probably dates to the 14th century. It's quite remarkable because it preserves a complete cycle of illustrations that were clearly popular among Byzantine readers. I've been able to trace them in at least 4 other manuscripts. These mental maps, as I would call them, depict key moments like the battle at Cunaxa or the crossing of the Kentrites River, and they are very simple in design, relying only on Xenophon's text. In a way, it's precisely that simplicity that makes them so compelling. They show us what the Greek commanders must have had in their minds at each stage. In the manuscript, you can see the Armenia illustration together with a small transcription I made, just to give you a sense of how these maps were meant to be read. What's missing, though, from all these illustrations is a sense of the bigger picture. That changes only after the Latin translation of Ptolemy, when really interest in ancient geography was renewed. And one of the most important figures here is the Dutch geographer Abraham Ortelius. His Thesaurus geographicus of 1596, which we have on display, is a work of enormous scholarly ambition. Essentially, a list of all ancient place names with their literary sources. I think the Anabasis alone is cited nearly 50 times. Today, Ortelius is best remembered for his early speculation about continental drift. Now, Plato tells the story about Atlantis, how part of it was torn away and survived as an island. And Ortelius basically says, isn't that exactly what we see when we look at the coastlines of America and Africa? But as you might know, his idea wasn't picked up until the 18th century, and he never got any credit for it. So, for those of you writing dissertations, it might be wise not to hide your best ideas between 700 pages of place names. Turns out no one will actually read the entire book. But in any case, it's only thanks to the work of Ortelius and others that later maps of the entire expedition became possible. The earliest example is this 1653 print by French geographer Pierre Duval. Although it was the first attempt to map the journey, it's really quite accurate. Later prints on the Anabasis hardly change. If you look closely, you can see many Greek place names taken directly from Xenophon, with Latin notes explaining key stages of the retreat. Yeah, it's perhaps no surprise that these prints were considered such valuable additions to the work of Xenophon that they quite literally became part of the text, just as we saw earlier with the ancient interpolation. A fine example is the 1696 Oxford edition of Xenophon by Edward Wells, which was published in 5 volumes. The first volume on the left I just had to include as it opens with a beautiful and quite early engraving of the Sheldonian, which may look rather familiar to most of you. I mean, it almost anticipates the lovely views from the Western Library Terrace. For our purposes, the second volume is more interesting as it includes, for the very first time, a printed map of the expedition, modeled directly after the print by Duval. Of course, many more editions followed in the 18th and 19th centuries, because by then the Anabasis, just like, for instance, Caesar's Gallic War, had become a standard school text, and everyone wanted to produce their own school edition of Xenophon, which led the Dutch scholar Rijksboom to call it the Xenophon factory. So really quite a wonderful image, I think. All right, moving on. Our last example brings us to the 19th century. While English schoolboys were reading, or more likely struggling with Xenophon in the classroom, others quite literally followed in the footsteps of the 10,000. In 1818, British diplomat John Kinneir published his travel account about his journey to India, where he devoted an entire chapter to the famous retreat. His work was partly political. There were fears over possible invasion routes into British India at the time, but I think it also reveals a deep personal fascination with Xenophon's story. Perhaps most remarkable is the map accompanying the book, where Kinneir set his own travels against those of Xenophon and even Alexander the Great. So it's a very, very hands-on approach to history, if you like. All right, there would be much more to say, but I think we'll have to end our journey with Kinneir. Thank you all very much.